Okay, welcome back everyone. We will continue with our emphasis on Middle America, which covers Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. This is the video lecture on history and culture. When we talk about the history and culture of this part of the world, it's important to look into the two of the largest civilizations that settled here before the colonization process began with Columbus. Two of the most important of these civilizations are the Aztec Empire and the Mayans. These are two of the most important. However, there were many other groups, especially in what we consider today as Mesoamerica, which covers the northern Central America and central Mexico region. This is an area that saw several civilizations emerge along about the same time that we saw civilizations in other parts of the world. The Aztec Empire is one of the most well known because of the encounter and the struggle of colonization with the Spanish. The Aztec Empire existed from 1300 to 1521, and the 1521 date is very specific because that is the year where we see the fall of the capital of the Aztecs, the city of Tenochtitlan. Another important city that is north of Mexico City is Teotihuacan. However, it should be noted that this city was not an Aztec settlement. In fact, when the Aztecs got to this part of Mexico, the city of Teotihuacan had already been abandoned for several hundred years. And so when the Aztecs found this city, they called it Teotihuacan, which in their language means city of the gods, because they were very impressed by this city that was abandoned, and so they thought it had spiritual connections. In central and southern Mexico and parts of Central America, the Aztecs, or the ethnic group known as the Mexica, who spoke Nahuatl, settled this region, and the Aztec Empire emerged as the most powerful military force that forced other peoples to pay tribute to them. In the reading on the conquest of New Spain, you will see that they were not the most supported, the most loved rulers, because they were very violent as well. They developed a warrior culture that allowed them to maintain control of the people that they conquered. They also developed intricate agriculture, trade, and, as I mentioned, tribute. One of the forms of agriculture they developed, urban agriculture, is chinampas, which is a way to reclaim land from the central lakes here of Tenochtitlan. And through that, they would build islands where they would plant corn, beans, squash, and other fruits and vegetables. Although the Aztec Empire collapsed, Nahuatl culture and the influences of these civilizations still remains present in Mexico today. The Mayans are different than the Aztecs. The Mayans existed before the Aztec period, and they were located here in the Yucatan Peninsula, along with Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras. The Mayans did not have a large empire, but rather they organized in city-states where they also had a lot of emphasis on agriculture and also fishing and trade. Many of the people of the regions of southeastern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras still identify as Mayans, as ethnically Mayan, and their language is still alive today, similar to the Nahuatl language, which is still alive today, and people still teach it and learn it in universities. As you will see in the reading, the process of conquest was very violent. The fall of the Aztec empires was precipitated by an alliance between the Spanish conquistadors and the Tlaxcaltecas, which was a group subordinated to the Aztecs that did not want to pay tribute to them, and so they joined the Spanish to conquer Tenochtitlan in 1521. The European conquest lasted over several centuries, And the goal of Europeans was basically to spread the Christian religion and claim territories for the church and the crown, but also to find gold and glory, or to acquire wealth and land. In part, you will see that the superior weaponry of the Spanish, especially metals like steel, allowed them to win militarily against the Aztecs. However, another thing that the European conquerors brought with them were diseases that were new to the New World. These were diseases like chickenpox, for example, that devastated the population, and we had several epidemics here of diseases where the people didn't really have an immune defense for, and so this led to a rapid decline of the population of the Americas, in addition with indigenous people losing their traditional way of life, but also being forced into slavery to work in the mines to extract gold. For the most part, the Spanish saw the colonies as a place to extract commodities like gold, but also agricultural products to export. Especially in Mexico, we're going to see the rise of the hacienda system, and in other parts of the Caribbean and South and Central America, we're going to see the rise of plantation economies. Because the indigenous population had been decimated by the colonization process, or because they would also escape, the new colonial powers in the region brought in enslaved people from Africa, and especially West Africa, to work in plantations in the Caribbean and in Central America, and later we will also see that next week in South America. And this new system relied on slavery because of the lack of workers to produce commodities like sugar, tobacco, cotton, that were tropical goods that could not be grown in Europe, but were very profitable, especially sugar, once it was exported back into the European continent. For example, the British and the Dutch also got into the competition for territories in the Caribbean by encouraging piracy against Spain. Some of the legacies of colonialism in the region are very visible. We have what is known as a process of transculturation, which is a blend of cultures that produce a new one. These cultures are European cultures and indigenous and African cultures that produce modern Latin American societies. Other legacies of this period is also racism and social hierarchies, especially racism towards Black and indigenous people. If you look at media and communications in Mexico, for example, and Latin America, most of the people that appear in television shows are mestizo or white. Mestizo is people who are thought to be, a mix of indigenous and Europeans. Another aspect of the legacy of colonialism is large land concentrations with a few rich families owning plantations and haciendas. Haciendas are basically plantation houses, similar to the southern United States, or plantations in the Caribbean. Another aspect of this legacy is the Catholic Church, which mixed with indigenous and African influences, spiritual influences brought from Africa, but also indigenous influences from the people. And of course, today, the languages of the Americas, the main languages like Spanish, Portuguese, etc., but also urban planning are these legacies of colonialism. There are many important revolutions in the 19th century that happen a few decades after the American Revolution. These revolutions took up the ideals of the American and the French Revolution and tried to extend them to the mass of the population. One of the most important revolutions, besides the American and the French, is the Haitian Revolution of 1791 to 1802, and this was the first successful slave revolt that expelled a world power, France, from the island and applied the ideas of the Enlightenment in a very radical way. Up until this point, the idea of democracy extending to formerly enslaved people was not very common, right? The idea that we were all equals and we all had rights, even if we didn't have land or even if we were not white, that was a very radical idea that the Haitian Revolution implemented. Because this was such a radical revolution, the European powers and the United States boycotted Haiti and forced Haiti to pay money to France for liberating themselves from French colonialism and slavery. The United States also did not trade with Haiti because they feared that Haitian sailors would bring ideas of liberation and freedom to the ports of the United States in New Orleans or in the South or the Southeast, and that American people that were enslaved in the United States would pick up on these ideas. So Haiti suffered quite a lot of economic blockades and boycotts because they had dared to revolt against the European powers. We also see several important processes of independence. I'm going to talk briefly about Mexico today. Next week, I'll talk about South America. But basically, around 1810 to 1820, the people that had been grown up in the Americas that were of mixed European and indigenous heritage were known as mestizos. And this group of people was in between the lower classes of the population and the upper classes that were tied to the crown back in Europe. And there were very rigid social hierarchies that did not allow the mestizos to become the new ruling class. So the first Mexican independence, or the War of Mexican Independence is basically led by mestizos, especially radical Catholic priests that were upset at the way that the Spanish treated locals and also indigenous people. Mexican independence and the independence of Central American countries happens at the same time because at this point in history, all of these colonies were part of New Spain or as part of the Spanish Empire. And so at first, the Central American countries were part of this new Mexican Empire. However, later on, they also became independent from Mexico. If you think about this period in history, California was also part of Mexico at this point. And so California was freed from European colonialism by the Mexican War of Independence, not by the American War of Independence against the British. Again, this was a territory of the southwest of the United States, was a territory settled by the Spanish. Although the Mexican independence won sovereignty from Spain, the social conditions in Mexico for the next 100 years were still very unequal. And as Mexico became integrated into the North American economy with the United States and Europe, there was a lot of inequality, especially in land. Most of the haciendas were owned by very few people, right? We had a very large disparity between the landowners, the indigenous people, and the peasants that worked the land. And so a popular revolution, a democratic revolution against the dictatorship later brought about a popular revolution that redistributed lands back to the indigenous people and the peasants, and that later on led to the nationalization of oil, the establishment of public education, the separation of the church and the state, and the development of modern Mexican identity. Okay, that's it for the section on history and culture. I will pick up in these topics in the section on history, on politics and economics.